It was supposed to be a fun night, the perfect escape from school stress and gossip. Sarah, Mia, and Jess had planned their sleepover for weeks. After a day at the mall, they were finally settling in, cozying up with snacks, ready for a marathon of horror movies. But something felt off. That man from earlier, the one they'd seen in the food court, had sent a chill down their spines with the way he stared at them. Too long, too intensely. Jess had even joked, "Looks like we've got ourselves a stalker." Now, that joke didn't feel so funny. They brushed it off, laughing nervously, and continued with their night. But when the doorbell rang at 11:30 p.m., the mood shifted. Sarah, being the brave one, stood up. "I'll check," she said, her voice wavering slightly. She peeked through the peephole and froze. "It's him," she whispered. Mia's face went pale. "What? Are you serious?" "The guy from the mall. He's just standing there, smiling." The three of them huddled together, adrenaline kicking in. Jess locked the door while Mia grabbed her phone to call the police, but the line didn't connect. No signal. The house, usually buzzing with Wi-Fi and cell service, was suddenly a dead zone. "He cut the signal?" Mia asked, panic setting in. Sarah checked her phone too, shaking her head. "This can't be happening." Then came the scratching at the front door, slow and deliberate, like nails dragging across the wood. It was followed by a soft knock. Tap, tap, tap. The girls backed away from the door, terrified. "We have to hide," Jess said, trying to stay calm. They dashed upstairs to Sarah's bedroom and locked the door behind them. Suddenly, the sound of glass breaking echoed from downstairs. The stalker had broken in. Mia's hands shook as she texted her mom, praying that some message would get through, but no response. The girls huddled in the corner, their breath shallow, ears straining to catch any sound. Footsteps, slow and heavy, moving through the house. "He's in," Sarah whispered, eyes wide with fear. The creaking of the floorboards grew closer, moving from room to room. The tension in the air was unbearable. Each footstep sounded like a ticking clock counting down to something horrible. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped, right outside the bedroom door. The doorknob jiggled. Mia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to muffle her scream. Jess picked up a heavy book, the only thing within reach, as if it could protect them. Then silence. Minutes passed like hours. Just as they were beginning to think he had left, the lights in the room flickered out. Complete darkness enveloped them. They couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Suddenly, a low voice came from behind them, from inside the room. "Found you." They whipped around to see the stalker standing by the closet, his face barely illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the window. His grin stretched unnaturally wide, eyes gleaming with malice. How had he gotten in without them hearing? Panic erupted. The girls bolted toward the door, but the stalker lunged at Jess, grabbing her wrist. She screamed, thrashing wildly as he yanked her backward. Mia and Sarah pulled at her arms, desperately trying to free her, but his strength was inhumane. As Jess was dragged across the floor, she kicked the bedside lamp, knocking it over and plunging the room into even deeper shadows. Mia and Sarah rushed to the hallway, slamming the door behind them. They could still hear Jess's screams echoing through the walls, but they knew they couldn't go back. Just as they reached the stairs, a shadowy figure appeared at the bottom. It was Jess, or was it? Her face was distorted, eyes hollow and black. "He's here," she whispered, her voice empty and cold. They screamed and ran in the opposite direction, down a narrow hallway, but it didn't make sense. This wasn't how the house was laid out. The walls seemed to stretch and twist. They were trapped in a nightmare, no longer in control of where they went. Suddenly, the hallway spiraled into a tight, suffocating space. The ceiling closed in, and the walls began to shift, as if alive. Mia and Sarah were swallowed into the darkness. They screamed each other's names, but their voices were lost in the void. And then, silence. When the police finally arrived hours later, responding to a frantic call from a neighbor about strange noises, they found the house completely empty. No broken glass, no sign of forced entry. Just a single chilling message written on the wall in red lipstick. Found you. To this day, no one knows what happened to the girls. But late at night, some say you can still hear them whispering, their voices echoing through the empty halls, begging to be found. It was a quiet Friday evening, and Emma and her younger brother, Max, were home alone. Their parents had gone out for a rare date night, leaving them with instructions to order pizza and not to answer the door for anyone. Emma, being 15, didn't mind the responsibility, especially since Max was pretty easy to handle. He was only 12, but smart enough to entertain himself with video games and not cause any trouble. The evening started normally. They ate their pizza in front of the TV, laughing at the cheesy horror movie Max had insisted on watching. The neighborhood was quiet, as it usually was. Their street, filled with elderly couples and families with young kids, wasn't exactly the type of place you'd expect anything weird to happen. But then there was Mrs. Carter. She'd moved in about 2 weeks ago, an elderly woman who lived alone in the old house next door. At first, she seemed sweet. She introduced herself to their parents, brought over cookies, and even complimented Emma on her lovely hair with a warm smile that reminded her of a friendly grandma. But something about her had felt off. "She's creepy," Max had said after their first encounter with her. "I don't like her eyes. They don't blink enough." Emma had rolled her eyes at the time, chalking it up to Max's imagination. But now that she thought about it, Max wasn't entirely wrong. Mrs. Carter's eyes were always wide, unblinking, as if she were constantly observing everything. And lately, she had been doing some strange things. It started with a cherry pie she brought over a few nights ago. At nearly midnight, Emma had answered the door, startled to find Mrs. Carter standing there in a nightgown, holding a steaming pie as if it were perfectly normal to be baking that late. "I thought you might enjoy a little late. Night treat, dear," she had said, her voice sweet, but her eyes fixed on Emma with that unsettling gaze. Emma had politely taken the pie, thanked her, and closed the door as quickly as she could. The pie remained untouched in the fridge. "I thought you might enjoy a little late. Night treat, dear," she had said, her voice sweet, but her eyes fixed on Emma with that unsettling gaze. Emma had politely taken the pie, thanked her, and closed the door as quickly as she could. The pie remained untouched in the fridge. Now, as the horror movie on TV hit its final jump scare, Max yawned and stretched. "I'm gonna head upstairs," he said. "You coming?" "Nah, I'll stay up for a bit," Emma replied, though she felt uneasy being the last one awake. But she didn't want Max to think she was scared. As Max trudged upstairs, Emma turned off the TV and glanced out the front window. The street was dark, only the dim streetlights casting long shadows across the road. Everything seemed normal until she looked at Mrs. Carter's house. There she was, standing at her window, bathed in the yellow light from inside. Mrs. Carter was staring directly at their house. Her face was pressed close to the glass, her mouth twisted into a crooked smile that sent a shiver down Emma's spine. And then, as if sensing Emma's gaze, she lifted her hand and waved slowly, the smile never leaving her face. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, and she quickly pulled the curtains shut. Her hands were shaking. "It's fine. She's just weird." That's all, Emma told herself, but the uneasy feeling lingered. She tried to distract herself by checking her phone, scrolling aimlessly through social media, but then she heard it. Music. Old-timey music, faint at first, but gradually getting louder. It sounded like it was coming from next door. Mrs. Carter must have turned on some old record player, but why was she blasting it so loud? The music was strange, something out of a black and white film with a slow, haunting melody. It sent a chill down her spine, making the air in the room feel heavier. Emma stood up, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread, and went upstairs to check on Max. When she reached his room, she found him fast asleep, his mouth slightly open, completely oblivious to the eerie soundtrack now playing in the background. She closed his door gently and headed back downstairs, her nerves on edge. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Emma froze. It was past midnight. Who would be knocking at this hour? Her mind immediately went to Mrs. Carter. She hesitated, her heart pounding. But then the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Don't answer it, she told herself, remembering her parents' warning. But curiosity and a growing sense of fear tugged at her. She approached the door slowly, peeking through the peephole. And there she was, Mrs. Carter, standing on the porch, holding yet another pie, her face illuminated by the porch light. Emma's stomach twisted. She backed away from the door, not wanting to open it, but then the music inside the house seemed to get louder, drowning out her thoughts. It was like it was seeping through the walls, crawling into her mind. Suddenly, there was a creaking sound from behind her. Emma spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The back door, the one leading to the yard, was slowly opening on its own. "Max?" she called, her voice trembling, though she knew it wasn't him. The only response was the eerie music playing on loop. Her pulse raced, fear crawling up her spine. She grabbed a kitchen knife, her hands shaking as she moved toward the back door. The yard was pitch black, and she couldn't see anyone, but the air felt wrong, like something was out there, waiting. Just as she turned to lock the door, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye, a shadow moving across the lawn. And then, that music had cut off abruptly. Silence. Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she fumbled to check it. It was a message from an unknown number. "Don't you like my pies, Emma?" Her blood turned cold. She raced upstairs, locking herself in Max's room. "Wake up!" "Max, wake up!" She shook him, her voice frantic. Max groaned, confused and groggy. "Whoa, what's going on?" he mumbled. "I think Mrs. Carter is trying to get in," Emma whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady. "She knows we're here. She's watching us." Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway outside. Slow, deliberate, and then a soft knock on the door. Max's eyes widened with fear. "She's here, isn't she?" Emma nodded, her heart racing, gripping the knife tighter. The footsteps outside their door stopped, and then, through the silence, a voice. "Why won't you come out, dears? I've brought something sweet for you." It was Mrs. Carter, her voice like nails scraping down a chalkboard. Emma's throat tightened, her mind spinning. Suddenly, the door handle started to turn. But then, as if the universe had snapped back into place, everything stopped. The door handle stopped moving, the eerie music was gone, and the house was eerily quiet. For a moment, Emma and Max just sat there, breathing heavily, waiting for anything to happen. Then, from outside, the soft whistling of an old tune floated through the air. The next morning, their parents returned, oblivious to the terror that had unfolded. Emma and Max tried to explain what had happened, but when their dad went to check next door, he came back with a confused expression. "The house is empty," he said. "No one's lived there for years." Emma's blood ran cold. She rushed to the window and stared at Mrs. Carter's house, the curtains drawn and the yard overgrown. Later that evening, as the sun set, Emma swore she saw a figure in the window, that same crooked smile watching her. And then, the faint smell of pie